The scent of antiseptic and polished floors greeted Elena like an unwelcome guest as she stepped through the automatic doors of City General Hospital. Her swollen belly, a firm globe of life beneath her coat, seemed to lead the way, a constant, heavy reminder of the future hurtling toward her. At 7 months pregnant, every movement was a deliberate act, every breath a conscious effort. She had walked these corridors before, but today, the familiar route to the maternity wing felt alien, the fluorescent lights casting a cold, clinical glow that seeped into her bones. This routine checkup was anything but. Her mind drifted, unbidden, to the cavernous silence of her own home, to the empty side of the king-size bed where her husband Richard should have been. The Richard she had married was a man of ambitious fire, but the millionaire he had become was a creature of cold calculation and distant business trips. Lately, his absence felt less like a schedule conflict and more like a deliberate withdrawal, a chasm widening between them that even the impending birth of their child could not bridge. A profound sense of foreboding, a cold knot in her stomach, tightened as she settled into a stiff plastic chair in the waiting area. It was a feeling that had been growing for months, a quiet dread that this life she had built was a beautiful, fragile facade. Her gaze wandered, skimming over the muted pastel walls and the other expectant mothers with their supportive partners. That was when she noticed him, a tall, authoritative man in a crisp white coat striding purposefully down the far corridor. A nameplate on his chest identified him as Dr. David Mitchell, hospital director. He carried an air of command, his silver-flecked hair and sharp profile striking a faint, almost forgotten chord of familiarity deep within her. But the memory was a ghost, obscured by the fog of years and a painful family rift she had been too young to fully understand. She dismissed the flicker of recognition, attributing it to the strange emotional state of her pregnancy. The sterile environment seemed to amplify her isolation. The hum of the ventilation system was a monotonous drone, a soundtrack to her loneliness. Each rustle of a magazine, each soft murmur from a nearby couple, served only to highlight the profound silence that enveloped her own existence. She wrapped her arms protectively around her belly, her hands cradling the restless life within. What future awaited this child? A life shadowed by a father's indifference in a home that felt more like a gilded cage with every passing day. The weight of her worries pressed down on her, as tangible and heavy as the child she carried, leaving her feeling utterly alone in a room full of people. The sterile calm of the hospital hallways shattered the moment Richard appeared. He was not a comforting presence arriving to join his wife, but a storm cloud descending, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the pale, medicinal walls. And he was not alone. On his arm, clinging with a possessive intimacy that stole the air from Elena's lungs, was a woman whose sharp beauty was as cutting as her gaze. Chloe, a name Elena had only suspected, whispered in the dark corners of her sleepless nights, now given a terrifying, vivid form. Elena's world narrowed to the three of them in that brightly lit corridor. The hum of the hospital faded into a distant roar as a heated argument erupted between Richard and his mistress, a vicious, whispered clash that was somehow more deafening than a shout. Chloe's eyes, cold and glittering, swept over Elena's rounded stomach with undisguised contempt. Her lips curled into a sneer as she made a mocking comment about the pregnancy, her words a venomous hiss meant to demean and belittle the sacred life Elena carried. The insult hung in the air, a foul odor that drew the stares of passing nurses and patients, their expressions a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Elena forced her spine to straighten, her hands trembling as she pressed them against her belly in a futile attempt to shield her unborn child from the ugliness. She focused on the cool tile beneath her feet, on the steady, frantic beat of her own heart, clinging to composure as if it were a life raft in a churning sea. But Chloe was relentless, her voice rising as she hurled another insult, this one a cruel jab at Elena's appearance, her worth, her very existence. Each word was a scalpel, expertly wielded to inflict maximum humiliation. Through the dizzying haze of shock, Elena's eyes found Richard's. She searched his face for a flicker of the man she had loved, for any sign of remorse or defense. What she found was a void. His demeanor was one of icy detachment, as if he were observing a tedious play in which he had no stake. There was no anger on her behalf, no shame for the public spectacle. His coldness was a deeper betrayal than any infidelity. It was an absolute erasure of their shared past, a silent confirmation that she and their child meant nothing to him. The depth of his callousness was a physical blow, more shocking and painful than any of Chloe's sharp-tongued barbs, solidifying the terrifying reality of her situation and setting the stage for a conflict far darker than she had ever imagined. A sudden, blinding fury contorted Chloe's beautiful features into a mask of pure malice. The simmering tension of the confrontation, the public humiliation, and Richard's passive approval coalesced into a single violent impulse. Before anyone could react, before Elena's mind could even register the shift from a verbal venom to physical threat, Chloe lunged forward. Her designer shoe, a sharp stiletto, connected with a sickening, brutal force against the soft, vulnerable curve of Elena's stomach. The world exploded into a white-hot nova of pure, unadulterated agony. A guttural choke scream was torn from Elena's throat as the impact sent her crumpling to the cold, hard floor. Her body curled instinctively around the epicenter of the pain, her arms wrapping protectively around her belly as a searing fire spread through her core. The polished linoleum rushed up to meet her, a hard, unyielding surface that offered no comfort. Her vision swam, the fluorescent lights above blurring into dizzying streaks as waves of nausea and sheer terror crashed over her. The life within her, once a source of gentle flutters and hopeful kicks, now felt terrifyingly still and vulnerable. The sterile corridor, once filled with hushed whispers, erupted into chaos. Elena's scream of pain was echoed by the shocked cries of onlookers, a dissonant chorus of alarm that echoed off the walls. The professional calm of the nursing staff shattered as they rushed forward, their training kicking in amidst the pandemonium. Kneeling beside Elena's shuddering form, their voices were a frantic but practiced murmur, trying to assess the damage, to offer some sliver of comfort in the face of such senseless cruelty. The scene was one of stark, horrifying contrast. The clinical order of the hospital violently disrupted by an act of raw, human viciousness. High above, from the panoramic window of his second-floor office, Dr. David Mitchell stood frozen. He had been drawn to the commotion, a routine glance downward that had transformed into a moment of gut-wrenching horror. His blood ran cold as he witnessed the kick, saw his niece, the little girl he had once bounced on his knee, collapse like a broken doll onto the floor. His face, usually a mask of professional composure, paled to a ghostly white, a silent roar of fury building in his chest. His knuckles turned white where they gripped the windowsill. His gaze locked on the scene below. He saw Chloe's face, not contorted in regret, but twisted with a triumphant arrogance as she took a half-step back, her posture one of smug satisfaction. And he saw Richard, standing inert, a statue of passive complicity who made no move to help his wife, his expression one of mild annoyance rather than frantic concern. In that single crystallized moment, David's purpose became terrifyingly clear. A silent, iron vow forged itself in his heart. He would protect Elena and her child, no matter the cost. He would dismantle the world of the people who had done this, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the justice they so richly deserved. The journey from his office to the ground floor was a descent through a maelstrom of contained fury. Every step Dr. David Mitchell took was measured, a deliberate act of will against the primal scream building in his throat. The elevator's sterile hum was a mockery of the chaos he had just witnessed, the polished brass doors reflecting back the face of a stranger. A man whose professional calm was a thin veneer over a tectonic shift of rage and protective instinct. He could still see it, the horrifying replay of Chloe's vicious kick and Elena's crumpled form on the cold floor, a silent film of brutality etched behind his eyes. The urge to storm into the corridor, to reveal himself as her uncle and unleash his wrath upon her attackers, was a physical ache in his muscles. But years of discipline and a deeper, more calculating need for true justice held him back. He emerged into the corridor like a ship cutting through turbulent water, his presence immediately altering the atmosphere. The frantic energy of the nurses and the shocked murmurs of the gathered onlookers seemed to still as he approached, his white coat a banner of authority. His gaze first swept over Elena, who was being carefully lifted onto a gurney by two ashen-faced orderlies. Her face was a mask of pain and tear-streaked terror, and the sight sent a fresh jolt of white-hot anger through his system. He forced his voice to remain low, steady, and utterly commanding as he directed the medical staff. His instructions were clear and precise, prioritizing Elena's care with a focus that brooked no argument, ensuring she would be rushed to the most secure examination room, attended by his most trusted obstetric team. Every word was a conscious effort, a dam holding back the flood of his personal connection. Then, his attention, cold and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, turned to Richard and Chloe. They stood apart from the commotion, a pair of beautiful entitled statues. Chloe was adjusting her sleeve, her expression one of bored irritation, while Richard had the audacity to look inconvenienced, checking the time on his platinum watch. David's jaw tightened. With a curt nod to the head of hospital security, who had just arrived with two burly officers, he gave the order. His voice was flat, devoid of any emotion that might betray his personal stake. He instructed them to detain both individuals for questioning, citing a clear case of assault on hospital grounds. He watched, a silent, vengeful witness, as the shock registered on their faces, Richard's arrogant disbelief, Chloe's indignant sputter. They were being escorted not to a police car, but to a secure administrative office, a temporary holding cell within his domain. Inside, David's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of rage and a desperate, aching need to comfort his niece. The desire to stride over to Richard, to grab him by his expensive lapels and snarl his identity in his face was almost overwhelming. But he smothered the impulse. Revealing himself now would be a catastrophic error. It would alert the predators, giving them time to circle their wagons, to use their wealth and connections to weave a narrative of lies and escape consequence. No, he would be a witness in silence, a ghost in the machine of his own hospital. He would gather every piece of evidence, every digital footprint, every witness statement. He would build an ironclad case so damning that when he finally chose to strike, there would be no defense, no escape. Justice, true and absolute, would be served, and he would be the silent, unseen architect of their ruin. The world was a blur of motion and muffled sound, a nauseating carousel of fluorescent lights on the ceiling, and the grim, determined faces of the medical staff surrounding her gurney. Elena's body was a single, throbbing nerve of agony, centered deep within her womb where the brutal impact had landed. Each jostle as they rushed her down the corridor sent fresh waves of fire through her abdomen, a cruel reminder of the violence that had shattered the sterile peace of the hospital. Her hands never left her belly, her fingers splayed protectively over the place where her baby lay, a silent, desperate prayer in her lips that the life within had been spared the worst of the trauma. Inside the quiet, dimly lit exam room, a fragile calm descended. The frantic urgency gave way to a methodical, gentle professionalism as a doctor and two nurses worked over her. Their touches were careful, their voices low and soothing as they hooked her up to monitors. The steady, rapid beep, beep, beep of the fetal heart monitor cutting through the haze of her pain. The sound was a lifeline, a tiny, rhythmic affirmation of hope in the crushing darkness. The doctor, a woman with kind eyes and a calm demeanor, performed an ultrasound, the cold gel a shock against her skin. The grainy black and white image on the screen showed a tiny curled form, a heart fluttering with stubborn life. The relief was so profound it was a physical ache in her chest. There was no serious harm, the doctor confirmed. No immediate danger to the baby, but absolute rest was imperative. The words were a reprieve, but they did nothing to soothe the deeper, more profound wounds that were bleeding inside her. As the medical team finished their assessment and began to withdraw, giving her a moment of solitude, the dam holding back her emotions finally broke. Great, heaving sobs racked her body, each one a fresh tremor of pain. She cried for the physical violation, for the terrifying moments of not knowing if her child was safe. But more than that, she wept for the emotional devastation, for the cold, public annihilation of her marriage and the future she had believed in. The image of Richard's detached face, his utter lack of concern as she lay broken on the floor, was a scar burned onto her soul. Then, through the thin wooden door of the exam room, his voice filtered in, clear and unmistakable. He wasn't asking about her condition. He wasn't expressing remorse. He was talking to the security guards, his tone one of arrogant, impatient authority. He was defending Chloe. She heard snippets, a misunderstanding, an emotional overreaction. My associate meant no real harm. Each word was another twist of the knife, a final cementing layer of betrayal. The man who had vowed to cherish her was now championing the woman who had tried to destroy the most precious part of their life together. The last fragile thread of hope she had clung to snapped, leaving her adrift in an ocean of utter desolation. A nurse re-entered quietly, her face soft with pity. She placed a warm blanket over Elena's shaking shoulders and offered a cup of water, her presence a gentle attempt at comfort. But Elena felt miles away, isolated within a fortress of her own grief. The kind words were just sounds, unable to penetrate the cold, hard shell of reality that had encased her. She was alone, truly and completely alone, with only the rhythmic beeping of the monitor as a testament to the one thing in the world she had left to lose. In the chilling certainty that the people who had hurt her were still just outside the door, believing themselves to be untouchable. The gentle tap on the door was a soft intrusion into the heavy silence of Elena's private room. She flinched, her body still coiled tight with the memory of pain, her hands instinctively returning to the protective cradle of her belly. The door swung open to reveal the hospital director, Dr. David Mitchell. He stood framed in the doorway, not as a figure of intimidating authority, but as a calm, concerned presence. His white coat was pristine, but his expression was carefully softened, the professional mask slightly lowered to reveal what appeared to be genuine empathy. He entered with a quiet, respectful air, closing the door behind him to seal them in a bubble of privacy away from the lingering chaos of the hallway. He did not sit, but stood a respectful distance from her bed, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, reassuring murmur, designed to soothe rather than interrogate. He posed as nothing more than a diligent administrator, a man whose duty was to ensure the well-being of a patient on his premises and to understand the distressing incident that had occurred. He asked gentle, open-ended questions about the confrontation, his eyes never leaving her face, absorbing the flickers of pain and fresh betrayal that crossed her features with each halting recollection. He offered reassurances about the hospital's commitment to her safety, his words subtly implying that the institution itself was on her side, that it would handle the matter with the utmost seriousness and fairness. There was a weight behind his calm demeanor, an unspoken promise of consequences that went beyond mere policy. As he spoke, a strange and unexpected sensation began to uncoil within Elena's bruised heart. Despite the fog of her distress, she felt an inexplicable kinship with this man, a pull of familiarity that was as confusing as it was comforting. It was not his words, but something in the gentle cadence of his voice, the specific way his brow furrowed with concern, that stirred a vague, dusty memory from the deepest corners of her childhood. It was the ghost of a feeling, the echo of a presence that had once meant safety, a tall figure lifting her onto his shoulders. The scent of his cologne, the sound of a deep, warm laugh. The memory was formless and fleeting. A wisp of smoke she couldn't grasp, but it left a residue of warmth in the cold emptiness that had consumed her. For the first time since collapsing on the floor, she felt a flicker of something other than sheer terror and despair. Dr. Mitchell concluded his visit with a final firm assurance, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than strictly necessary, as if imprinting her image on his mind. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod before turning and exiting the room as quietly as he had entered, leaving behind the faint, clean scent of soap and starch. The moment the door clicked shut, the carefully constructed compassion on David's face solidified into a mask of grim determination. The brief connection, the glimpse of his niece's profound vulnerability, had fanned the embers of his fury into a controlled, white-hot blaze. He walked away from her room with a new singular purpose etched into his very being. The time for passive observation was over. He was done posing as a neutral party. It was time to uncover every one of Richard's secrets, to tear his world apart, and he would start by turning his own hospital inside out, beginning with its most confidential records. The cold, biting wind of the hospital parking lot did nothing to cool the heated confrontation unfolding between the sleek black contours of Richard's luxury sedan. The vehicle, a symbol of his wealth and status, now served as an arena for their reckless confidence. Richard slammed his palm against the polished roof, the sharp sound echoing in the vast concrete space. His face, usually a mask of composed arrogance, was flushed with a different kind of heat, not shame or fear, but the thrill of impending dominance. He leaned in close to Chloe, his voice a low, forceful growl, meant for her ears alone, yet carrying the weight of a public declaration. He boasted not of love or regret, but of power. His wealth was a shield, his connections a sword, and he laid out his plan with the cold precision of a corporate takeover. Witnesses could be bought, their memories conveniently altered by the persuasive power of money. Hospital staff, he sneered, were always underpaid and easily intimidated. A few threats of legal action, a promise of ruinous lawsuits against their careers, would ensure their silence. He spoke of manipulating the narrative, of painting Elena as emotionally unstable, the unfortunate victim of her own hysterical imagination. The assault in the hallway was, in his telling, about to become a tragic misunderstanding, a minor incident grotesquely exaggerated by a fragile, pregnant woman. There would be no consequences, he assured her, because the world was a system he had long ago learned to game, and he held all the cheat codes. Chloe listened, her body leaning against the cold car door, a smirk playing on her perfectly painted lips. Her arms were crossed, not in defiance, but in supreme satisfaction. She watched him with the possessive gleam of a collector admiring her most prized and most useful acquisition. His rage and his ruthless strategy were not alarming to her. They were a validation of her control over him. She had provoked the confrontation, delivered the blow, and now he was mobilizing his entire empire to cover her tracks. His desperation to protect her, even from the consequences of her own brutality, was the ultimate testament to his enslavement. In that moment, she felt invincible, insulated by his money and his moral bankruptcy, believing their combined arrogance made them untouchable. They were a perfect, toxic symbiosis, standing in the shadow of the very institution where their victim lay recovering. They saw the hospital as just another entity to be manipulated, its director a bureaucrat to be bypassed or bribed. Their vision was so myopically fixed on each other and their own perceived invulnerability that they remained utterly blind to the silent, gathering storm. They did not see the figure standing at a second-floor window, partially obscured by blinds, watching their animated, gesticulating forms with the cold, still focus of a predator. They were unaware that Uncle David was not a passive administrator, but a master of this domain, already mobilizing the vast resources at his disposal, turning the hospital's own records and security apparatus into weapons aimed directly at the heart of their fragile, prideful world. Their laughter, sharp and condescending, was a fanfare for their own impending downfall, a sound that failed to reach the ears of the man who had already begun to dismantle their lives, brick by gilded brick. The silence in the private room was a heavy, suffocating shroud, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical beeping of the fetal monitor, a sound that was both a comfort and a cruel reminder of her precarious reality. Alone at last, the thin veneer of composure Elena had maintained for the doctors, for the kind director, finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The dam holding back the torrent of her grief burst, and a low, guttural moan escaped her lips as she curled into herself on the stiff hospital bed, her body racked by pains that seemed to tear from a place deeper than the physical pain in her abdomen. Her mind, treacherous and unbidden, drifted back through time to a world painted in the warm, golden hues of a love that now felt like a lie. She remembered a different Richard, a man whose laughter was not a weapon of condescension, but a sound that filled their small apartment with light. She saw them tangled together on a sofa that was too small, planning a future that stretched out before them, bright and endless. She remembered his hands, not cold and dismissive, but gentle on her face, his eyes not empty voids but pools of unwavering devotion. They had dreamed of this child, of a family built on a foundation of that love. Now those memories were like shards of beautiful colored glass, cutting her from the inside out. Each happy recollection was followed by the searing image of his face in the hallway, impassive, detached, as Chloe's venomous words and then her violent foot connected with the life they had created together. The comparison was a devastating abyss. How had the man who once whispered promises of forever become the stranger who watched her be assaulted without a flicker of emotion? The question spiraled into a darker, more insidious interrogation of her own worth. What was so fundamentally lacking in her that he could discard her so easily? Had her love been too quiet, her presence too plain, her very soul too insignificant to hold his attention? The pregnancy that had once been her greatest joy now felt like a trap, an anchor chaining her to a man who viewed her as a nuisance and to a mistress who saw her child as a threat. She was caught in a web of deceit weaved by the two people who should have been her protectors, and every struggle to break free only seemed to tighten the silken, poisonous strands around her. A soft knock preceded the entrance of a nurse, her face a canvas of gentle sympathy. She carried a small tray with a steaming cup of tea, the fragrant scent of chamomile, a feeble assault on the room's atmosphere of despair. She placed it on the bedside table with a quiet, reassuring touch on Elena's shoulder, her eyes speaking volumes of unspoken understanding before she withdrew, granting Elena the fragile dignity of her private breakdown. But the kindness was a distant star in a pitch-black sky. Elena's tears flowed freely, hot and salt-stung, tracing paths through the cold sweat on her temples and soaking the starched white pillowcase. She did not reach for the tea. She simply lay there, trembling, grappling with the shattered fragments of the reality she had known, each piece a sharp reminder that the life she had loved was gone, and the future was a terrifying, uncertain void, where the safety of her unborn child was the only flickering, fragile light in an overwhelming darkness. The door to the hospital's central security office clicked shut, sealing Dr. David Mitchell in a world of humming servers and glowing monitors. The air was cool and smelled of ozone and dust, a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil that had raged through the corridors just hours before. Here, in this digital sanctum, he would begin his counterattack. He dismissed the technician on duty with a quiet but firm command, needing the absolute privacy that his position afforded. Alone, he settled before the bank of screens, his fingers flying across the keyboard with a practiced, grim determination. The time for silent witness was over. Now was the hour of the hunter. He pulled up the security footage from the main hallway, the timestamp aligning with the moment his world had tilted on its axis. On the high-definition screen, the scene played out with a chilling, sterile clarity that the raw emotion of the moment had obscured. He watched Richard and Chloe's approach, their body language a blatant display of intimacy and shared arrogance. He saw the moment Chloe's face twisted, the premeditated shift in her posture before she launched her vicious kick. He watched, his own breath held, as Elena crumpled, her form collapsing like a felled sapling. But it was Richard's reaction, or lack thereof, that David rewound and watched again. The man didn't flinch, didn't move to catch her, didn't even look surprised. His expression was one of mild annoyance, as if he were watching a minor traffic delay. This was not a crime of passion. It was an act of casual cruelty enabled by absolute indifference. David's jaw ached from being clenched so tight. Leaving the damning video running in a loop on one screen, he navigated to the hospital's internal database, accessing confidential patient logs and financial records. He typed Richard's name into the system, and the history that unfurled was a tapestry of entitlement and fraud. Over the past 2 years, Richard had repeatedly used his wife's connection to the hospital, her prenatal appointments, to justify numerous suspicious transactions. He had siphoned funds, falsifying invoices for medical equipment that was never delivered and services that were never rendered. Funneling thousands of dollars into shell companies David traced back to a web of offshore accounts. It was brazen, the act of a man who believed he was too powerful to be audited. A separate search for Chloe revealed her own sordid history. She was not a stranger to City General. She had been brought in 6 months prior after a violent altercation at a high-end bar, her name logged alongside a security report detailing her aggressive, uncooperative behavior with the nursing staff. The pieces were falling into a horrifying, perfect picture. David picked up his private, encrypted phone, his thumb hovering over a single saved contact. He pressed call, and a gruff, no-nonsense voice answered on the second ring. David spoke in low, precise tones, laying out the framework of what he needed. He gave the private investigator Richard's name, the shell companies, the offshore account numbers, and a directive to dig deeper, to follow the money trail until he found every last hidden dollar and every incriminating partner. He provided Chloe's full name and details, instructing him to uncover her entire background, financial, personal, criminal. He wanted a complete profile of their lives, a dossier of their sins. As he hung up, a cold sense of resolution settled over him. The anger was still there, a burning coal in his chest, but it was now encased in ice. The evidence was being gathered, the net was being woven. He was no longer just a concerned uncle or a hospital director. He was an architect of justice, patiently, methodically building a case that would annihilate the gilded fortress Richard and Chloe believed would protect them, leaving them with nowhere left to hide. The scent of old books and lemon polish filled the memory, a warm, safe aroma from a time when the world was simpler. David was younger then, his hair thick and dark, his laugh a booming, joyful sound that echoed through his sister's sun-drenched living room. In the center of that remembered warmth was Elena, a tiny girl of 6 with flyaway curls and grass-stained knees, shrieking with delight as he spun her in dizzying circles, her small feet flying off the ground. "Again, Uncle David, again," she would beg, her trust in him as absolute as the summer sky. He was her doting uncle, her protector, the one who mended broken dolls and whispered promises that monsters weren't real. He had made a quieter, more solemn promise to his sister, Elena's mother, as she battled the illness that would eventually claim her. On her deathbed, her hand frail in his, he had vowed to always watch over Elena, to be the steadfast guardian she would need in a world suddenly stripped of its softest light. The memory shifted, the warm hues leaching away into the cold, stark tones of a bitter argument. The rift had not been with Elena, but with her father, a man of stubborn pride and different ambitions for his daughter's future. A disagreement over money, over influence, over the very direction of Elena's life had escalated into a furious final schism. Harsh words were spoken, lines drawn in the sand of their family. David, bound by his promise, had stood his ground, but his brother-in-law's will was an immovable force. He was cut off, exiled from Elena's life. The door to that sunlit living room slammed shut and locked. For years, he watched from a distance, a ghost at the periphery of her life, catching glimpses of her growing up in school photos, in rare, awkward family gatherings, where he was tolerated but not welcomed. The promise to his sister became a constant, aching weight in his chest, a duty he was failing to fulfill with every birthday and graduation that passed without him. He channeled his frustration into his career, building City General into a bastion of order and healing. A kingdom where he had control, all the while knowing his true purpose, the protection of his niece, remained tragically unfulfilled. The memory dissolved, snapping back to the present with the jarring clarity of a slap. David stood in his deputy's office, the door closed against the hum of the hospital. The man before him, Mark, was more than a subordinate. He was a friend of 20 years, a man who had seen him through professional triumphs and personal sorrows. David's usual composure was gone, stripped away by the raw events of the day. He leaned heavily on Mark's desk, his knuckles white, the image of Elena's broken form on the floor, and Richard's cold arrogance burning behind his eyes. "The woman who was attacked today," David began, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "Her name is Elena Vance." "But she was born Elena Rossi." He paused, letting the name hang in the air, watching the dawning recognition in Mark's eyes. "She is my niece, my sister's daughter." The confession was a floodgate opening. He spoke of the promise, the estrangement, the years of silent, helpless observation. He detailed everything he had just uncovered: the security footage, the financial fraud, Chloe's violent history. The professional resolve in his voice was now underpinned by a fierce, personal vendetta. "I stood by for too long, Mark," he said, his gaze steely. "I honored a foolish family silence, while that man poisoned her life. I watched from my window as that woman tried to destroy the last piece of my sister in this world." He straightened up, his decisions solidifying into an unshakable conviction. The time for gathering evidence in the shadows was over. The time for hiding was done. The truth comes out now, today. I'm bringing Richard in. It's time he learned exactly who he's been dealing with and exactly what happens when you break the only promise that ever truly mattered. The summons to the director's office arrived not as a request, but as a command, delivered by a security guard whose impassive face offered no room for negotiation. Richard entered the spacious, wood-paneled room with the entitled swagger of a man who believed all doors open for him. His expression won a bored irritation. He expected a bureaucratic nuisance, a minor official to be intimidated or bribed. He did not expect the scene that awaited him. Dr. David Mitchell stood not behind his desk, but before the large window, silhouetted against the gray afternoon sky, the city sprawling beneath him like a map of his domain. He turned slowly, and the air in the room seemed to still and grow cold. There were no pleasantries, no offers of a seat. On the polished mahogany desk between them lay two files, their covers open like the jaws of a trap. David's voice was quiet, yet it carried the weight of absolute authority. He gestured to the first file, which contained a series of high-resolution stills captured from the security footage. The images were damning in their clarity. The moment of the kick, Elena's body contorted in agony, her collapse to the floor. Richard's face, frozen in a frame of detached indifference, was positioned beside them. David then indicated the second, thicker file. It was a forensic accounting report, detailing a complex web of embezzlement, phantom medical supply orders, inflated service invoices, and the intricate trail of funds siphoned from hospital coffers into Richard's private offshore accounts. The evidence was laid out with the chilling precision of an autopsy report. Each line item a nail in the coffin of Richard's carefully constructed life. For a moment, Richard was speechless, his arrogance momentarily stunned into silence. Then the facade snapped back into place, harder and more brittle than before. A condescending smirk twisted his lips. He dismissed the assault photos as a regrettable emotional incident and the embezzlement evidence as fabricated nonsense. His voice rose, laced with the familiar threat of legal retribution. He promised lawsuits for defamation, for harassment, for every conceivable violation. He vowed to bury the hospital and its director in so much litigation they would be bankrupt before the year was out, his wealth a bludgeon he believed could smash any obstacle. He paced before the desk, a caged predator trying to dominate its keeper with noise and bluster. David did not move. He remained by the window, a statue of calm amidst Richard's storm. He let the threats hang in the air, let them echo and then fade into the room's oppressive silence. When he finally spoke again, his tone was deceptively soft, almost conversational. He hinted at more, much more. He mentioned a private investigator with a particularly deep reach, and a mistress with a past far more checkered than Richard likely knew. He spoke of phone records, of hidden assets, of witnesses who were no longer afraid to talk. With each subtle revelation, the color slowly drained from Richard's face. The bluster began to crack, revealing the panic beneath. This was not a negotiation. It was an unveiling. Then David took a single deliberate step forward. The professional mask of the hospital director slipped, just for an instant, and something far more personal and dangerous flickered in his eyes. His voice dropped to a near whisper, yet every syllable was razor sharp. "You see, Richard," he said, his gaze locking onto the other man's. "This was never just about hospital policy. You made this personal the moment you laid a hand on my family." He did not elaborate, did not name the relation. He simply let the possessive, fiercely protective pronoun hang in the space between them. My family. The implication landed with the force of a physical blow. Richard's smug confidence evaporated, replaced by a dawning, icy dread. He was no longer facing a bureaucrat. He was facing a man with a deeply personal and now fully unleashed vendetta. The ground beneath his feet, which he had believed to be solid gold, had just turned to treacherously thin ice, and he was staring into the freezing, dark water below. The sleek, insulated world Chloe had so carefully constructed around herself shattered in the span of a single, ordinary afternoon. It began with a knock on her penthouse door, not the polite tap of a delivery person, but the hard, authoritative rap of someone who expected immediate entry. When she swung the door open, her expression one of annoyed impatience, she was met not with a familiar face, but with the stern, unyielding gaze of two police officers, their badges gleaming under the hallway's recessed lighting. Behind them stood Dr. David Mitchell, his presence a silent, chilling anchor to the reality she had tried to dismiss. The words they spoke, "Chloe Sterling, you are under arrest for assault," were not just a legal declaration. They were the detonation of her entire existence. The cold click of the handcuffs around her wrists was a sensation more shocking and humiliating than any she had ever known. The metallic bite a stark contrast to the smooth, expensive gold bracelets she usually wore. The ride to the station was a blur of flashing city lights and her own frantic, disjointed thoughts. But the true collapse began in the interrogation room, a small, airless box with walls the color of dried mud. It was there, under the relentless probing glare of the detectives, that she saw the first headlines splashed across the tablet screen. Her face, a perfectly curated image of glamour, was juxtaposed with grainy, long-lens photos of her and Richard entering hotels, their intimacy laid bare for public consumption. The articles did not paint a picture of a powerful love affair. They detailed a sordid tale of a millionaire's mistress, a homewrecker, a violent woman who attacked a pregnant wife. The word mistress was a brand, searing away the illusion of status and power she had cultivated. Her social media, once a shrine to her enviable life, was already flooding with a torrent of vitriol and scorn from thousands of strangers. Her world, built on the fragile pillars of Richard's wealth and her own ruthless ambition, was crumbling into dust in real time. A new, more primal terror began to eclipse her initial shock. Richard, where was he? Why hadn't he stopped this? The cold, calculating part of her brain, the part that had always understood their relationship as a transaction of power, now screamed a warning. He would not go down with her. He would cut his losses, sacrifice her to save his empire and his reputation. The man who had promised her the world was undoubtedly in a room with his lawyers, already crafting a narrative where she was the unstable, obsessive other woman, the sole architect of the violence, while he was the misguided, temporarily led astray husband. The realization was a bucket of ice water dumped over her head. She was utterly alone, and the life raft of his protection was being deliberately paddled away. Panic, sharp and acrid, tightened her throat. Her eyes darted around the featureless room, searching for an escape that did not exist. Then a desperate, survivalist instinct took over. Her demeanor shifted from one of stunned arrogance to one of calculated victimhood. Tears, real ones born of sheer terror, welled in her eyes. She leaned forward, her voice trembling as she spoke to the impassive detectives. She began to weave a new story, a tapestry of half-truths and outright lies. She was not the aggressor, she insisted. She was a pawn. She painted Richard as the master manipulator, a man who had groomed her, promised her a future, and then orchestrated the entire confrontation. He had encouraged her jealousy, she claimed. He had whispered poisonous suggestions about Elena. He had created the very conditions that led to her moment of tragic, provoked weakness. She shifted the blame with the skill of a seasoned performer, attempting to transform herself from the villain of the piece into just another one of Richard's many victims. But her performance, though compelling, was undercut by the cold, hard evidence David had provided. The security footage that showed her unprovoked, triumphant cruelty. Her downfall was not just a legal consequence. It was a moral one. The unchecked ambition and casual cruelty that had propelled her to the top of her gilded world were the very traits that now ensured her spectacular public ruin, a stark symbol of the fact that no fortress of arrogance is ever truly impregnable. The fall of Richard Vance was not a quiet, private affair, but a spectacular public unraveling. A collapse broadcast across financial news tickers and splashed across the front pages of tabloids. The legal charges landed with the force of a sledgehammer, each one a meticulously crafted blow from the case David had built. Fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy to obstruct justice. The list was long and damning. The evidence was irrefutable. The security footage of his passive complicity during the assault, the forensic paper trail of funds stolen from the hospital, the phone records showing his frantic attempts to bribe witnesses and silence staff. His wealth, the fortress he had believed would protect him, became the very thing that attracted the most aggressive prosecutors and the most intense public scrutiny. Banks froze his accounts. Business partners dissolved contracts. And the empire he had built on a foundation of deceit and arrogance crumbled into financial ruin within a matter of weeks. The social disgrace was even more absolute. The man who had once commanded rooms was now a pariah, his name synonymous with betrayal and cowardice, his photograph forever linked to the image of his pregnant wife lying injured on a hospital floor. Empowered by the tidal wave of evidence and fortified by David's unwavering visible support, Elena found a strength she never knew she possessed. The frightened, broken woman in the hospital bed was gone, replaced by a resolute mother fighting for her child's future. With David standing firmly beside her, his presence a constant, solid reminder that she was no longer alone, she met with her lawyer and filed for divorce. The petition cited not only adultery, but also cruel treatment and abandonment, painting a picture of a marriage that was emotionally barren and physically dangerous. The legal proceedings that followed were a study in contrasts. On one side was Richard, increasingly haggard and desperate, his legal team scrambling as his resources evaporated. On the other was Elena, composed and determined, her case backed by the formidable, silent authority of her uncle and the overwhelming weight of the truth. The final court proceedings were the culmination of David's silent vow in the hallway. They were not dramatic, but they were profoundly just. The judge, reviewing the extensive documentation, granted Elena a swift divorce and awarded her full sole custody of her unborn child, citing Richard's proven instability and his direct role in creating the environment that led to the assault. The ruling on the financial and criminal charges followed, a litany of guilt that stripped Richard of everything that had once defined him. As the gavel fell, its sound was a clean, final note. It was not a sound of vengeance, but of closure. Richard's empire was dust, his reputation in tatters, his future a long, bleak landscape of legal battles and incarceration. The themes of justice were not whispered. They were carved into the court record for all to see, a testament to the fact that cruelty and corruption, no matter how gilded, would eventually be met with their equal and opposite force. In the quiet of the courthouse hallway afterward, Elena stood for a moment, the formal paperwork clutched in her hand. The weight that had pressed upon her for months was gone. She felt light, unburdened, the strength she had found solidifying into a permanent part of her character. She looked at David, who waited for her a few steps away, his expression one of quiet pride and profound relief. The battle was over. The justice she had been granted was not just a legal verdict, it was her freedom, her safety, and the secure future of her child. Richard's world had crumbled, but from its ruins, Elena was finally, truly building her own. The pain was a distant, receding tide, each powerful contraction a wave bringing her closer to the shore of a new world. In the soft, focused light of the delivery room, surrounded by the quiet, encouraging murmurs of the medical team, Elena pushed past the final vestiges of her old life, the betrayal, the fear, the crushing loneliness. And then, cutting through the fog of exhaustion, came a new sound, a sharp, indignant cry that filled the room with its raw, vibrant energy. A tiny, perfect wail that was the most beautiful symphony she had ever heard. The doctor lifted the squirming, pink-skinned infant and placed her gently on Elena's chest. The weight was impossibly light, yet it anchored her to the earth with a force more powerful than gravity. Her daughter, her fingers trembling with awe and exhaustion, traced the curve of a downy cheek, the miniature perfection of 10 tiny fingers. All the pain, all the heartache, melted away in the face of this profound, overwhelming love. She was a mother. The world had been remade. He was there, a steady, silent presence in the corner of the room, having insisted on being present despite hospital protocol. Uncle David watched the moment of birth not as a director, but as a man witnessing a miracle. When the baby's cry pierced the air, the rigid control he had maintained for months finally broke. A single tear traced a path down his cheek, swiftly wiped away, but the emotion was laid bare in the softness of his eyes, in the way his shoulders relaxed as if a great burden had been lifted. He moved to Elena's side, his large, capable hand coming to rest gently on her shoulder, a wordless communication of immense pride and shared joy. He looked down at his grandniece, his gaze filled with a fierce, protective wonder. The long years of estrangement, the silent vigil, the furious campaign for justice, it had all led to this single perfect moment. The circle, broken for so long, was now whole again, mended not by words, but by this new, breathing, crying testament to their shared blood and resilience. In the quiet days that followed, Tiamayo, in a sunlit room filled with flowers, the final threads of their family bond were woven back together. There were no grand speeches or tearful apologies for the lost years. The reconciliation happened in the quiet moments. David carefully supporting Elena's head as she sipped water, his voice reading a children's story in a low, rumbling tone to the sleeping infant, the way Elena's hand would find his when a wave of postpartum emotion washed over her. The love was simply there, an undeniable force that filled the spaces between them, stronger and more real for having been tested. He was no longer the mysterious hospital director or the ghost of a forgotten uncle. He was her rock, her family, the guardian his sister had begged him to be. The promise, at long last, was fulfilled. With her daughter swaddled securely in her arms and David's unwavering support a constant at her side, Elena stepped out of the hospital and into the crisp morning air. It did not smell of antiseptic and fear, but of damp earth and possibility. She was not returning to the gilded cage of her old life, but walking toward a small, bright apartment David had helped her secure, a place that was hers and hers alone, filled with light and waiting to be filled with the sounds of a new family. Her focus was singular now, narrowed to the breathtaking reality of her child and the slow, steady work of healing her own spirit. The story closed not with an ending, but with a wide-open beginning, underscored by the profound power of hidden connections that had emerged from the shadows to shield her, in the quiet, unyielding resilience of a heart that had been broken, but had learned, against all odds, how to beat even stronger.